Welcome to the Finding Heroes podcast, brought to you by Ancestry. Like the online series, we investigate lost war artifacts. And by digging into Ancestry's family history records, we're able to connect forgotten heroes with their present-day families. On this episode, we'll discuss the Martin Mariner search and rescue plane that went missing in December 1945. The same night as the disappearance of the infamous Flight 19. For the first time, you will hear families talk about their loved ones lost on the Martin Mariner. Enjoy the podcast with military historian Professor David O'Keefe and me, filmmaker and historical investigator Wayne Abbott. Well, Dave, this is a special moment. We're bringing Finding Heroes into the podcast world.
Yeah, what a complete leap. I mean, we've been doing this on film for a number of years. And of course, we did it in nice little packaged versions for Ancestry. But now this takes us to a completely new level.
Well, what I like about the podcast, platform, is we can go much deeper into the stories, because Finding Heroes is all about connecting lost and mysterious war artifacts with military service people, soldiers, sailors, airmen, and then connecting it to a living relative.
Yeah, and I think, the strength and weakness of it, if you will, is you get a packaged conclusion at the end. In other words, here it was, here's what we found, here's the impact on the family. But of course, what people are really interested in is, well, how we make the sausage, if you will.
Yeah, the process is, this is going to give us an opportunity to kind of share our process, because both of us are research nerds, aren't we?
Well, yeah, a little bit more than that, I could say, but yes.
Well, you are professor.
Yeah.
I'm titled as a historical investigator, but we both spend a lot of time in the archives, and it is exciting, isn't it? When you start going down a rabbit hole with research.
That's the mystery with it all. And it's intoxicating. As I teach my students, you never know what you're going to find when you flip a page. You never know how history or how we understand something is going to change in a heartbeat. And that's the beauty of doing what we do.
Yeah. And it's also a great partnership with Ancestry, because we've been using Ancestry's family history records for years, even before we had any connection with them. It's where I usually begin. My first steps of research is going, especially when I'm trying to locate a person or a soldier, the best place to start is the family history records. And it's a wealth of information. And you can really put together a lot of information about someone just by going into the Ancestry records.
Oh, yeah, without a doubt. I mean, I've used it quite extensively in my research, what I do. But also, too, of course, there's also the military aspect. There's also Fold 3, which is part of the Ancestry family, which has military records. So you add the genealogical with the military, and you've got, an incredible research tool at your hands.
And especially, we're going to show it off in this episode.
Yep.
I mean, this to me, I'm pitching myself that we're actually doing this story, because the artifact in this episode is a lost plane that has not been found.
Yeah, it doesn't exist, if you will.
Yeah.
Right? It did at one point, but we have never found one trace of it, and my, have we looked. And of course, the incident we're talking about is the loss of a PBM Martin Mariner that was out searching for the missing planes, or the lost planes, of Flight 19 in December 1945.
Which is literally one of the great aviation mysteries that still haven't been solved, isn't it?
Exactly. And it does touch on the whole, myth of the Bermuda Triangle, the legend of the Bermuda Triangle. When you talk about the Bermuda Triangle, Flight 19, no aircraft have ever been found, and the Mariner, they are lumped right in the middle.
The good side of the triangle myth is that it keeps Flight 19 and the Martin Mariner in the public's eye.
Yeah.
The negative thing is, this is one of the worst military disasters to happen on American soil or in American waters ever. And you kind of lose sight of the fact that 27 men went missing and lost their lives that night.
Yeah, I guess that is the double-edged sword, as you say. In other words, the Bermuda Triangle is great because it puts butts in the seats. It gets people's attention. But unfortunately, it can have the effect of watering down the tragedy and the drama of actually what happened to that night to all those men.
Yeah. So in this podcast, we're going to double down into the plane, and most importantly, the 13 men that were on the Martin Mariner. So why don't we bring up a photo of the Martin Mariner? I think we need to kind of set up. And
Sure.
again, everybody, if you're listening to this podcast on one of your major podcast apps, that's great. If you want to see the visuals, please go to Ancestry's YouTube channel, because there's a video version.
Yep.
And they'll see us, and they'll be able to see all the visuals that we're showing. This is a special podcast. There's a lot of elements to this podcast. So this is the only photo ever taken of the Martin Mariner, also known as Training 49, its ID number.
Yeah, that's amazing. I mean, for those of you who've never seen a Martin Mariner before, it is a big flying boat. And these were remarkable. I mean, they were essentially double-decker buses in the sky. You've got a crew of 13 men who live on board. I mean, this thing was so big, it even had a kitchen.
And you can tell from this photo, especially the size of the window where the pilot sits, on how big this is. And this photo was taken on November 17th, 1945. So only 3 weeks before it went missing.
3 weeks before.
Yeah. I mean, it's fascinating. So let's go back to December 5th. I think we really have to set up the story before we get to the men. From the perspective of the men that were eventually on the Martin Mariner, they would have been probably going a normal day at Naval Air Station, Banana River.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until about, I think, around 6 o'clock where they got the report that there was planes missing, and 13 of them volunteered to go up and search for these missing planes. They took off at 19:27 that night, and 23 minutes later, they disappeared.
Yeah, they disappeared.
And over the years, I've become so connected to this story because of the fact that these men had nothing to do with what was going on with Flight 19. They literally just got the report and they volunteered their service to go out and find them. So in order to kind of understand this story, take us back now 5 hours. It was like 5.5 hours. Take us back and tell us the story of what happened with Flight 19.
Yeah, Flight 19, it's called Flight 19 because it just happened to be the 19th training mission on that day. And it was a routine navigational exercise. They were going to fly out towards the Bahamas, and they were going to basically do a triangle, if you will, and fly back. This was standard. This was something that they did every single day. But then suddenly, a couple of hours in, there were some radio messages coming back to Fort Lauderdale, where they took off from, saying that, look, we don't know where we are. We seem to be lost, and we need help.
It was after their first leg, after they did a training bombing run over the Bahamas, that all of a sudden they seemed to get disoriented. And the lead pilot, who was Charles Taylor, thought for some strange reason he was over the Florida Keys.
Now, I mean, there's always been a controversy over that. Did they actually fly the route that was written on the chalkboard in the training room? People have assumed that. But remember that Charles Taylor, before going up to Fort Lauderdale, was based in the Keys. He was down in the Miami area, so he was used to his own training ground. So there is a possibility. The only thing we know for sure is when they finally got what they call a direction finding fix on the radio from his plane, it was actually off the East Coast, not the West Coast. He thought he was off the West Coast of Florida, somewhere in the Gulf for some reason. But they were actually off the East, and they were heading northeast, parallel to the Florida coast, heading up towards Georgia. So at least we know the one basic fact that they did exist in that area at that time.
Yeah. I mean, more than likely, Flight 19 was always over the Bahamas or north of the Bahamas. And then there was just a series of, I think, questionable decisions by command at NAS Fort Lauderdale that then led to around 6 p.m. where they had to call and got 13 volunteers to go out on the Martin Mariner. And that's when they took off at 19:27, and 23 minutes later, they're gone.
They're gone. I mean, this is one of the things, you mentioned it. You know, when they finally get this direction finding fix, they know the men on Flight 19 have been squabbling amongst themselves over which way to go. And all they had to do was send that information about, here is where you are, to those aircraft. And for some reason, somebody dropped the ball.
I mean, that was another big problem, because they didn't tell Flight 19 where they were.
No, and had they, then they would have been able to adjust course, go 90 degrees, and fly back to Florida, which, if that was the case, then maybe the Martin Mariner never gets scrambled, never takes to the air.
That's what we're getting to. The unfortunate series of errors and I think poor decision-making that led to the men being scrambled to get on the Martin Mariner.
Yeah.
They took off at 1927. The pilot, whose name was Walter Jeffrey, gave an A-OK to the control tower. 23 minutes later, it just disappears.
It disappears.
What happened at that moment at 1950?
The theories of what happened, it seems that there was a mid-air explosion. And we know this, or at least we understand this, because the Navy's investigation revealed that there was a ship called the SS Gaines Mills, which happened to be going by around the same time, which noticed a fireball in the sky, roughly about 100 feet in size. Nobody really knows for sure what caused that explosion and whether that explosion was in the air or whether that was coming up from the surface. So in other words, it could be that it was a mid-air explosion, or it could have been exploding when it hit the surface of the ocean. Nobody is sure.
Until the wreck is found, and maybe if the wreck is found, we'll shed some evidence into what happened. But somebody on the Gaines Mill saw the fireball and the explosion. But the strange thing is, none of the plane and none of the crew members were ever recovered.
No, that was the interesting thing, that if it was in the location where they claimed it would, you would have assumed that some sort of wreckage, debris, and perhaps even some of the remains of the crew members would have washed ashore over the years. But nothing. There was no trace of either the planes of Flight 19 or the Martin Mariner.
And we've tried. We've been on expeditions that have tried. And that's where it was. Like early in my career, it was more like, let's try to find the plane. And then I think it was around, 5 or 6 years ago, I just started questioning, I wonder who was on. Because you never mentioned, with Flight 19, there was always names.
Yeah.
But with Martin Mariner, nobody ever said the names of the 13 men. And that's the most important thing. And especially with this podcast, is to shed some light on them. So it was just important for me at this point to just see. I wanted to put faces and stories to a list of names who were lost in 1945.
Yeah, and I think, this is something that you and I were talking about, and you mentioned this. And, the guys who went out on Flight 19, it was tragic. It was a horrible accident. They were victims of various things that came together that night. The guys in the Martin Mariner were acting heroically. They volunteered to get on to a search and rescue aircraft in bad weather, going out there, risking their lives, and ultimately giving their lives for their comrades. I mean, that is something that is really slipped through the pages of history books.
It's really the forgotten plane out of the Flight 19 story. Everybody hears about the 5 Avengers. I mean, even Steven Spielberg put the Flight 19 planes in the opening and closing of Close Encounters of the Third Kind, which only enhanced, of course, the idea that Flight 19 got strangely abducted by aliens. But there has been no evidence that we've come across that anything strange or, supernatural happened to these planes. It just seems like a series of unfortunate errors, bad luck, bad timing. But really, what always connected me with the Martin Mariner is the fact that these men did volunteer to go out and try to find Flight 19.
Yeah.
And up until I think we came along, nobody's given the time of day to these men that lost their lives in 1945. And because where I began in the research process is I had the list of 13 men. And to this day, I've put a profile together of 11 of the 13. There's still 2 that I have not been able to find any info on. And I just went through the list and got into the Ancestry family history records. And I just started at the top with Walter Jeffrey, Harry Grimes Cone, and Roger Allen. And these are names that they've become part of my life now. And I was just looking for any information. And I kind of just did a kind of a broad search. And the first thing I noticed is that these men came from all across the United States. And I went, wow, what a representation at that time. And then it was the ages. The oldest crew member I can find right now is the pilot, Walter Jeffrey, was 27.
57.
And what hit me the hardest, 3 of them are 18 years old.
Wow.
3 were 18. And that just kind of floored me. And that was before I made any contact with families. It was just the initial research to find out that 3 of these men were young men, were just 18 years old.
Yeah, I mean, that's the beauty of research when you start it and you're looking at just, the names, the basic data, but then it starts hitting you, doesn't it? The themes come out, right? And like you said, 18-year-olds. Why were there 3 18-year-olds? What possessed them to join up? Why were they there at that time?
So my next bit was I honed in on to see if any of the crew members had children. I thought that would be the easiest way. It's usually the easiest way for us to find living relatives if there's children.
Yes.
So you're not going into the brothers, sisters, nieces, great nieces. And I managed about a year ago to find information that the pilot Walter Jeffrey had a son. And that was all based on finding the 1945 census, Florida census. And it gave me the information I needed. It said Walter Jeffrey, 27. It said Monica Jeffrey, 25, I think. And there was 2-year-old Walter Jr. And I thought, okay, this is it. And thinking that Walter at this point was the only child of a crew member from the Martin Mariner. So I had the opportunity last December for one of our Finding Hero online episodes to interview Walter Jeffrey Jr. in California. I flew down there and I actually spent the afternoon with him last year, December 6th. And I say that only because it was, it was 78 years prior where on that day, what his mother and his grandmother and all the other families of Flight 19 and the Martin Mariner must have been going through. So we're going to show an excerpt now from the Finding Heroes episode that you can see on Ancestry's YouTube channel. But this is me interviewing Walter Jeffrey, and this is the first interview he ever gave about his father. Because you were only, 2.5 years old when your father went missing on the Martin Mariner. I mean, what did your mother say about your father?
That he was a very caring, very loving man. She was without a doubt in love with him till she died.
At the time I met Walter, I only seen one photo of his father. So I was wondering if he had a few others to show me. And boy, did he. Is this when he first enlisted?
Yes, I believe it says 37, 38.
So this is when he was about 20 years old.
Correct. And this is their wedding picture.
And this is your mother, Monica?
Yes.
Walter had so many wonderful photos.
This is the only picture that I have of him in the plane.
Even one of his father as a pilot. He just looks natural there, doesn't he?
Yes, it looks happy. It looks happy. This is late 43.
This is such a stunning photo. When Walter showed me this beautiful photo of him as a 6 to 8 month old baby in the arms of his mother and father, it really touched me. That's when I had to show him the 1945 census form. I thought I would surprise Walter with the information that he was the only child of a crew member from the Martin Mariner.
And this was 1945?
That was 1945. But he surprised me.
Because my brother...
Your brother?
Was born in 1945.
I mean, Walter had a brother. I mean, there was no evidence of anything that I came across in the files and records that said that Walter and Monica had a second child.
He was 7 weeks old when Dad was killed.
And what's your brother's name?
Robert.
Robert. So this census must have been done then, sometime in the summer, because your father's listed at 27, so he turned 27 in June. So prior to October, that window.
Between June and October.
So you're listed and your brother isn't.
Yes.
I don't know, it touches me even more to know that there was 2 of you. That's a great excerpt.
Is it ever?
And it was so incredible to meet Walter because it took so long to find him. Because part of the research is like you go in and you dig into the files and you look at the census forms and you get military files. But then it's finding the phone number, the email, the way to contact them. And it took a while to get in touch with Walter.
Well, I mean, you've done this more than I have. I've done it on occasion, but, for the stuff you and I have been working on, you're the one who's usually the point guy in making contact with the family. Take us through. What's it like making that first phone call?
Well, it's just as an example, when I actually found Walter's son who called me up and I was driving along the road and had to pull over. And I go, I've actually talking to somebody who's directly related to Walt Jr. And then he gave me his father's number and I chatted and very briefly, and we just set up the shoot to go down. But the great thing is Walter gave us that interview, and now we are going to interview, and I'm sure this will be his first interview. We're going to bring on Robert Jeffrey and his daughter Michelle from Arizona. How are you?
Just fine. How are you?
Oh, we're great.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, you're our first guest on the Finding Heroes podcast.
Wow.
And Michelle, and thank you, because you drove like 7 hours to to be with Robert today, right?
Yep, I did.
Robert, maybe you can take us back. You were less than 2 months old when your father went missing. I mean, when did you start to understand that your father went missing in December of 45?
Well, at my grandmother's house, my dad's picture was always on the wall. And so I, at some time, asked about him and got a very sketchy answer from Grandma. And so most of it was that nature until I was older. And then I was curious and I started reading up on the flight and my dad's plane. When I did some teaching, so I was teaching junior high school kids. So I explained what my dad's plane did and why, and about him, that he, during the war, he was up in Alaska and rescued a down pilot. So it took the mystery out of his disappearance somewhat. I mean, there's no doubt it's still a mystery.
And where did you hear most of your information? Did your mother tell you a lot, or was it your grandmother?
It's my grandmother, I think, most of it. I was a sickly child in the beginning, and so I spent a lot of time at her house in Highland Park. And so she had stuff. My grandma collected a lot of stuff. And so I would look at it and then question her about that.
Were you able to find out over the years anything to do with the rest of the crew?
I didn't learn their names, but I did learn about Taylor, because my mom and grandma both received a letter from a relative of Taylor's discussing some of the things.
This letter that Robert's talking about, Dave and I have been part of this story for years, and we've never seen one like this.
No.
This was written by Charles Taylor's aunt, his mother's sister, to your mother. And this is like 8 pages. Yeah, we've been trying to dissect this letter. I mean, what did you think of it when you first read it?
Well, first of all, remarkable, because I've never seen anything like this in any of the files that we've ever come across. But I think, it seemed to be heartfelt. I mean, the Taylor family really felt, in their own way, responsible to a certain degree, even though they were, without a doubt, trying to defend the honor of Charles and to say that he wasn't completely at fault for this. And I think there's some fairness to that. But at the same time, they were commiserating with your family. In other words, thanking them for the sacrifices that your family made on behalf of trying to find their son and his flight. And I think it's an incredibly touching letter, to say the least.
Now, the one thing I was going to ask you, Michelle, is there a date? Is there an envelope with a date on it, a postmark?
It's actually the envelope that it came in. It was actually in this envelope.
And what's the postmark? What does it say?
It is postmarked Corpus Christi, February 26th, 7:30 p.m., 1946, Texas.
What did you think, Michelle, when you read it over?
I didn't realize how long it was going to be at first.
Yeah.
So the details in it were just, for at that time, you had said heartfelt, and I totally agree. Just sharing the information from their own investigation that they had, and just and to take the time to write an 8-page letter to let us know, let my grandparents know of what was going on, and just kind of to share the information that they had found was really sweet and kind.
I mean, that's one of the things I've noticed when working on aviation stories is there's a certain bond that is pretty unique in the sense because most aviators, when they're lost in combat or lost in operations like this, they're missing and they're declared missing and their bodies are usually never found. So it takes a while for the government to establish the circumstances and be able to render them presumed dead or dead. And then it takes even longer, and sometimes it never really happens where the families have to come to terms with this. And so maybe I can ask you, your mom, was she still holding out hope that, until the pronouncement of death came in? Do you know whether she was still holding out hope that he might still walk through the door one day?
I think she still, my grandmother wrote the Navy a couple of times because she had a dream that there was an island that they were on, and it was in Spanish, and she gave that to the Navy, and the Navy said that island does exist and it had been searched, but it was by a different name.
Really? So this is your grandmother that had a dream and contacted the government about an island?
Yes.
Wow, I didn't know that. Walt never said that to me.
As far as I know, my mom never really believed that my dad was dead until she died. And grandma never did either. They all held out hope.
I mean, what is it after all these years that makes you still pay attention to that?
Well, my dad's my hero. And not having that closure, because I never knew him. So to me, it's all stories, and I would like to get closure on that story.
Yes.
So
Totally understand that, Robert. We're going to pause our interview here, and we're going to bring you back at the end of the podcast because we have something special planned. But Robert, it's been incredible to finally, meet you and Michelle, and get your thoughts on your father and the Martin Mariners. So if you hold tight, we have a few more stories to tell, and then we're going to bring you back. Okay?
I want to thank both of you for keeping my dad's memory alive by doing this, because 78 years that it's gone on, and it's like I said, as time goes on, people forget, and I don't.
Well, it's important to us to keep the story of the men who were on Training 49, the Martin Mariner, alive, because I think they were forgotten way too long.
I agree.
Thank you.
So we'll bring you back at the end of the podcast, but thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
I mean,
wow.
To hear him say
it's
a hero.
I know. It's amazing to think, it's, and, you and I have talked about this. I lost my father when I was a kid, so I certainly understand what he feels like. The more you hear about your father, the more you want to know about him, and particularly in a situation like this where he died, and his body's never been found. I mean, that's a very, very difficult thing to deal with, even all these years later.
And it is when you think about the 13 families plus the other 14 on Flight 19, 27. Imagine today, 27 naval air personnel going missing off the coast of Florida. Like, just imagine.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, I think that's why people, it just gets frustrated when it gets tied into the Bermuda Triangle.
Agreed.
Because they forget about the sheer, I guess, tragedy of the event that night.
Yeah, that's the problem with the Bermuda Triangle. It when you lump it in with that, even though that's in popular notion or popular culture, that's what we think about. It does tend to trivial or appear to trivialize it. And you're right. What does get lost is the fact that it was one of the biggest tragedies. And there were 27 families that night, 14 on Flight 19, 13 on the Martin Mariner, whose lives were changed forever. So after making contact with the family of Jeffries, what did you do after that?
Well, then my focus really went into the 3 18-year-olds. I don't know. I was taken by how young they were. And so I literally, I have some information here. I found the family of Alfred Zawicki. They were from the Chicago area.
Yeah.
And I did, even before I made contact, I realized that Alfred was the oldest of 5 children.
Who's the oldest?
And the thing that got me is that you could see the birth and death dates of the other 4 siblings. All 4 of them, I just remember thinking, lived fairly long lives. I think his sister Alice lived to 89. And I kept just thinking, Alfred died at 18, but his other 4 siblings, had good, long, healthy lives. And I realized I started focusing in on the daughters of Alice. And all of a sudden I made contact with his niece, Lynn. And I was able a few days ago to talk to Lynn. And I know you've not seen any of these videos, have you?
No, not at all.
So this is my conversation excerpt from it with Lynn, the niece, Alfred Zawicki.
Well, we did call him Fred. My mother called him Fred. My mom is his sister. Alfred was the oldest, then my mother, and then 3 other siblings after that. I never knew him, unfortunately, because he disappeared 8 years before I was born.
And his mother's name was Bernice?
Bernice, right. And his father was John.
So when did you first start to hear stories about your Uncle Fred?
Well, my grandmother always had this picture up, a picture of him when he was in the Navy. This was always up on top of her console TV in her apartment. So we always saw that growing up, and I'm sure we probably asked questions of who he was.
So how old was he in that picture, do you think?
Well, I would think, since he died at 18, I would think he was maybe 17. I know that my grandmother had to sign papers to allow him to join the Navy. But I have not found any dates when that was. The sad part was that his father died in 1943 at the age of 42.
And how did he die?
He had a massive heart attack. I always feel so bad for my grandmother. Here she was, a widow at 40 with 5 children on a farm that she had to sell and auction everything off. And she moved back to Chicago because her sister lived here.
What do you know about how Fred's disappearance affected the family?
Well, I know my grandmother felt very bad because she had to sign those papers to let him go. And I also know that she always thought he would come home. She always thought.
Always believed that he would come home.
Yes, that he was, since there was, he just disappeared. And I guess she had her own conspiracy theory, I guess.
She had a conspiracy theory?
Yes, she thought because he was bilingual and spoke Polish and the Cold War was going on, that this group was recruited, or however that worked out in her mind, to become spies. And
she thought that Alfred was a spy, possibly.
That could have happened. And I think that's how she accepted his disappearance, that he was still alive and doing this for, yeah. So, but yeah, she always expected him to come home.
And so to the day she died, she was really hoping that Fred would walk through the door.
Right.
And
Yeah.
so now it's almost 80 years after that Alfred went missing. I mean, does the family talk about him? Is there,
Well,
I don't
ever
know, does
since
his memory live on in the family?
well, not as much. No, not really. Since you contacted me, I've been looking into his life and researching, and talking to my cousins and my sister, and just to see what we all know. Um, and he's sort of come alive for me. And I'm going to keep his picture on my stand over here next to the couch. Just yeah, he had so much life ahead of him, and it's such a very sad story, and for my family as well.
What do you think?
Well, it's really interesting to see. I mean, I love the way that she started to, go back and think about things that she's never thought of before. And that's, really what this research does, right? It opens up these things. But fascinating part too is that Pandora's box, if you will, of conspiracy theories that people sometimes will themselves on. I find that very, very interesting. And a lot of that has to do with not having proper closure. There's hope that's always eternal. And you always keep that hope. And then sometimes it manifests into interesting stories, to say the least.
Well, what touched me was the fact that, Alice's father died in 43. And then, Bernice had to deal with losing her husband. And then 2 years later, losing her son.
After signing the papers to let him join up early. And so in that photograph, I would say he's 16 or 17 because if you were 18, you did not need parental permission, but you could, if you were 16 or 17, join up with parental permission.
Yeah, and Bernice, very much like Bertha, Walter Jeffrey's mother, they just didn't give up hope. I think they really, really hoping that their sons would walk through those doors and say hello and give them a hug. And unfortunately, again, this is the fallout of the Martin Mariner. I want to take you through a few of the other families that I found and through the research. One of the stories that I was dedicated to finding is if there was another, like besides the Jeffrey kids, was there another crew member with that had children? So when we started the process of trying to find more families after meeting Walt, I kept trying to research Wiley Davis Cargill, and I kept questioning it. Why, he was married in 39. At that time, you would think that he'd have kids.
I mean, you would assume.
So I couldn't find anything until I started focusing on his wife, whose name is Ouida. It's Ouida, Ouida Cargill. On Ancestry, I went to her family tree, and immediately I saw a 1950 census. And I clicked on it, and then everything made sense. She had remarried by that point to a gentleman with the last name Wallace. And on the 1950 census, there was 2 children listed. Wiley Wallace, 9 years old, and Helen Wallace, 5 years old. And it just clicked, and I'm going like, these can't be Wallace's kids.
No, obviously, one of them, the 9-year-old in particular.
Yes, yeah. And named after Wiley.
Yeah.
And it was that. I mean, for whatever reason, they were given the name, they list them as Wallace, but they were never a Wallace. And it didn't take long to find out that they kept the Cargill name. They went to the same high school. And, but then I still had to dig deeper. And then I focused on Helen because I realized that Wiley Davis Cargill Jr. died a few years ago. So I started focusing on Helen, and luckily contacted her son, and he called me back immediately. And this, you're going to see now a piece that I just recorded with Helen a couple of days ago. So why don't we run the piece on another child from a crew member of the Martin Mariner. And this is Helen talking about her father, Wiley Davis Cargill. I was searching, for somebody from, Wiley Cargill's family for so long, and that just a couple of days ago that we got in touch, and to think that I'm talking to the daughter of Wiley Davis Cargill is a true honor. It really is.
Well, thank you. I've heard some pretty wonderful things about my dad.
Yeah.
So
Well, then tell me, what have you heard about Wiley?
apparently he was a pretty great guy. He was kind. He was extremely smart.
Well, you sent me some photos of him, and yeah, he looked like a movie star.
That's what his brother said. Said he always looked up to him. Ed Cargill was his brother, and he's just recently passed. And Ed looked up to him like I could not believe. He just worshipped him.
Now, how old were you when your father went missing on the Martin Mariner?
I was 18 months old. My older brother, Wiley Jr., was, he's 3.5 years older than I am.
So take me back then. What's your earliest recollections of hearing about your father and the incident about the Martin Mariner going missing off the coast of Florida?
Listening as small children do to adults talking. I can't remember the first time. It was always talked about, rarely in front of my mother, but my grandmother worshiped the ground he walked on, and she talked an awful lot about him and what a wonderful father he would have been had he lived. And my uncle on my mother's side, he always had great things to say about him. So I had a lot to live up to.
Having two small children and then losing her husband, how did this affect your mom?
Greatly. Really did. She was absolutely devastated. And I feel like it affected her the rest of her life. She's a pretty remarkable woman. She had her issues, but she kept 3 kids together and raised us.
So then how about you then? How much have you thought about your dad through the years? And
An awful lot. I wondered what we would have missed, both him and me, because I think I would have been a daddy's girl.
why don't you tell me, because I know you mentioned about the sketch that a family member gave you just a few years ago, and tell me that
This one?
story.
This one right here?
Yeah, I can't believe it's a beautiful self-portrait that he did.
Yeah.
So when you saw that portrait especially, what were your thoughts?
Oh, my knees got weak. I looked at it, I couldn't believe it. It was just because I had no idea. I knew he was musically inclined, but I had no idea that he was artistically inclined.
You didn't know that your father did any kind of sketching?
No, I did not. And as far as I know, that's the only surviving sketch.
But it means a lot to you because you were or are a graphic artist.
Yeah.
So up until then, you had no clue that you seemed to have your father's talent.
No clue whatsoever.
It's
Yes,
uncanny that there's this blend between your father and you.
Yeah.
And it seems like he's been with you ever since.
Oh, yeah. He's always with me.
Is that amazing?
That's fantastic.
Yeah. Wow. And I only made contact. It took so long. I only made contact with her about 5 days ago and interviewed 2 days ago, and wanted to surprise you with these videos. But what do you think?
Oh, that's amazing. I just love that. I mean, look, this is what this is all about. This is opening the doors to something that happened in the past, connecting people. And, even in this particular case, just stirring up, whether we're bringing something to them or just creating that thought process of, wait a second, let me go and take a look in this attic. Let me take a look in this old trunk. Let me see what's here. you can see there's something about it. And you and I have talked about this for years, how we don't understand what it is, but we know it's something, and we know it's something powerful, and it's connected like that. And you can see that there.
Oh, it was just such a pleasure speaking with Helen. But I think now this is going to be really special. Can we bring all of the families together? Because this is the first time ever that they're meeting. So there's Helen. Hello, Helen.
Hi, Helen.
There's Lynn.
Hi, Lynn.
And there we are.
Ah, there they are again.
This is so special. Yes, yes.
All right, you better do the introductions here.
Well, Robert, Jeffrey, Michelle, Lynn, Helen, you guys are, this is really quite special to see you all together. Not only, I think, we were the first ones to ever contact you, this is now the first time virtually that families who lost somebody on the Martin Mariner have met.
It's so special.
I agree with Helen. This is a wonderful way to honor our family, or our men in our families, and also to remember them, because like you said, Wayne, it is forgotten. So thank you. Thank you for doing this.
Yeah, it's amazing. We're sitting here, it's 80 years later almost, and you're finally getting a chance to meet each other for the first time. I mean, what do you feel right now?
All my life, I've gone through the drawer that my mother had. There was a little log cabin that she had stored an awful lot of things, like men put their cufflinks in and that kind of thing. And I would sneak in her room and open this drawer and look at everything that she had. And my curiosity would always get the best of me. I would open this little tin box that she had saved with a few of his medals and belongings, and I would very gently take them out along with the letters and other things. And I would spend hours when I knew she would be gone just pouring through them. And I would very gently place them back in exactly the same spot she had them, because I didn't want her to know I'd been snooping. But it was my grandmother and my relatives that knew him, that talked about him, that gave me an insight to the type person he was. And I just hoped that he'd be proud of me as a daughter.
Oh, I think he would have been. Helen, you have an incredible amount of memorabilia left over from your father. Lynn, do you want to say something about Alfred?
Well, I don't really have much. I envy you, Helen, that you had so much to know about your father. I did not know much about my uncle. There wasn't much memorabilia with him other than the picture of him that my grandmother always had in her living room. And most of the stories I heard about him was from my mother, who was his next sibling in line, and that he was always fascinated with planes, and that he begged his mother to let him join the Navy, and so she had to sign for him to join at an earlier age. And yeah, so that's unfortunately I don't know as much as I'd love to about him.
What really hit me with Alfred, and it was the fact that they were all young. I mean, Walter might have been the oldest at 27. There's still a couple of names I haven't been able to find any information on, but Walter was 27, and there was 3 18-year-olds. And that really touched me. And Alfred was one of them when I started my research. But is there anything, Michelle and Robert, you want to say? Because it's so amazing seeing, all, you guys on the same screen together.
Well, my grandmother collected a lot of the stuff that we have. And my mom had a lot of stuff. My mom had his medals. I have my dad's wings. So that's the the connection, I think, that I have from one military person to another.
There's also a general story that, I found talking to all of you, and is that there was always someone, usually the mother, that kind of held on hope because they weren't found. And I found that was a common theme in almost all the families, is that because they went missing, that there was some hope that they were going to walk in the door again.
Well, my mom told one story that she heard my dad call her name. And this was when I was a teenager. Whatever you want to think of it. But for her, he still existed.
I just want to say that my grandmother, my grandfather was the love of her life. So when she passed away, we even had the Navy scatter her ashes for us at the last known location that he had recorded. So that was something we were special enough that we were able to do for her.
That's wonderful. I contacted my father's half-sister since we've talked, Wayne.
Really?
And I asked her if she remembered anything. And she was about 5 years old when he died. But she said she did remember her father and her and one of her brothers going to the beach on the Atlantic side, and her father holding her hand and looking out and saying, "My son's out there somewhere. I don't know where, but he's out there." She said that was the only thing that she could remember having been said about my father.
Would have been one of 27 families feeling the same way that night, without a doubt. Almost 80 years ago, one of the biggest tragedies in the history of the United States in non-combat roles. And, here we are, like I said, 80 years later, and kind of putting the pieces back together and making sure that the story is never forgotten.
It's been a pleasure to meet all of you, and it's a pleasure to hear and an honor to hear the stories of your loved ones who were lost on that plane. And I think the Martin Mariner and Flight 19, these men should never, ever be forgotten. But want to thank all of you.
Yes.
And we'll be in touch, and we'll definitely share all the contact info so you guys can stay in touch.
We appreciate that.
Thank you very much. Wow, David.
Wow.
What a way to end this first initial podcast. Are you kidding me?
Oh, I wasn't expecting that, to be honest with you. I knew you had a few rabbits up your sleeve, but bringing the families together like that, first time for them meeting each other.
Not only did we bring them together, this is the first time they've ever talked about their loved ones. And I think that's what's so special and so special about what we do.
It is. And, we've experienced this in the past where you get people who are now going upstairs into the attic, opening up that old chest, or going down, wait a second, we got something in the basement. It was handed down for many years. What could be in there? You never know.
Well, there's just going to end on, I think, the video of Lynn where she's talking about Alfred. And I asked her, I said, do your family, is there a lot of talk about Alfred? And she says, no. But she says, now there is.
Yeah.
And she's going to leave Alfred's picture out so that she can see every day. And I think that's kind of the beauty, and that's kind of like what I want to hear. What I want to get out of this is just see that the families themselves can talk about their loved ones.
Exactly. You never know who's in your past.
Yes. Well, I think that was a successful first podcast.
Yeah. Say the least.
Emotionally draining. I hope everybody who was listening and watching enjoyed it. And also, I just want to promote the next episode because it's going to be just as powerful and just as personal. And it's a World War I story where we actually go down into a cave that is on a World War I battlefield.
One of the most iconic, Vimy Ridge in France. So, of course, without giving too much away, but teasing it up enough.
That's right.
There you go.
And thank you for listening and watching the Finding Heroes podcast.
Whether you're watching or listening to this episode of the Finding Heroes podcast, thank you for joining us.
If you haven't yet, head to Ancestry.com to start your own family history journey today for free.
Also, follow us wherever you get your podcasts and be sure to subscribe to the Ancestry YouTube channel.
To stay up to date on episodes of the Finding Heroes podcast and to watch even more amazing content.
We look forward to sharing more with you very soon.